Our next story is called Luggage.
From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. And after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, and they began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's communication headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and then moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, which is the resort town about 88 miles away from London where GCHQ is located. And there he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth was a highly valued team player whose genius in mathematics and technology helped his group win a number of Britain's highest awards for international code breaking. In 2009, one of Britain's other main intelligence agencies, the famous Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, they were so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job to come over and work for them. This was a very rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the kind of Hollywood sense of the word. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond, and so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving to London, he regretted his decision. He hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars and flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared he felt that way. But at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. Before he left MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London. And for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anybody looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer from Gareth, the officer got the key to the apartment from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth. There was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs to see if maybe Gareth was up there. He's yelling for him the whole way as he's going up. He gets to the second floor. There's nobody up there, but there's a closed door. And what he finds on the other side of that closed door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and there was nothing unusual about the bathroom, except in the bathtub there was this big red duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub. There were also no fingerprints on the bag itself, or on the 2 zippers, or on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby sitting on a table, and it had been factory reset. And later, investigators would determine it had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on CCTV footage, and it was also the day that they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it. There was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed that he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The thermostat inside of Gareth's apartment was jacked way up, so it was very hot inside of his apartment, despite the fact it was summer and it was the height of the summer in August. But regardless, the excessive heat in his apartment sped up the decomposition process and made it impossible to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory is MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent has come out and said he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and said that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it all down, removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least one time he'd had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar-sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, all over the lock, the zippers, all over the tub? Because when he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident and was closed 3 years after his death.
This episode is called She Haunts Me. On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son. But Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water. But Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town. The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away, George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter, and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. And it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. Three years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone, and so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences, they were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible, nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick, he was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here, she haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said. They were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. If one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and, said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason. A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing, and Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while two of the neighbors held up lanterns and three others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the two daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. And in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver, and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. They were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed, feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die, but if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter, when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena.
On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their 2 friends, Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip, and when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing, there was no roof, but the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery, and then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town. That at night, it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone. And so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling this story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the Sis Stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It it was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. He was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again, he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church. And for a second, the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it and he turned back to the group. And it was Anna, who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sophia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still. And so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again, he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. That must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched the stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. This is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away. Get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened?
Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts, completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, download the Amazon Music app for free or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. Hey, it's Mr. Ballen. For the first time, my show, Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted for a special episode. A redacted medical mystery uncovers how routine surgery leads to classified government operations. Listen now on the Medical Mysteries or Redacted feeds, or search A Redacted Medical Mystery wherever you get your podcasts.
And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cyst stone. But behind them, Sophia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cyst stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cyst stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cyst stone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique at this point did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there. But Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it, he's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sofia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward, looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, "Come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on." And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sofia heard the sound of the stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, "Oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together." Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, "Hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal?" And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sofia, and he goes, "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted." And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret, because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Serkos inside of it, and then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Serkos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Serkos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Serkos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Serkos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, okay, show us proof. But the elderly man said, well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried. And so the soldier said, okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now. And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Serkos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Serkos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, go, dig that one up. But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, no way, we're not going near that grave. And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back, and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave. But because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops. And then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town.
Hey listeners, MrBallen here. What if I told you that some of the strangest, darkest, and most mysterious stories happening right now are all connected to what might be the biggest crime of our generation? You know I'm always on the hunt for the most chilling and perplexing tales out there. Well, I've discovered a new podcast that uncovers real-world mysteries unfolding right now, much like how another Ballen Studios podcast, Redacted Declassified Mysteries, brings hidden government secrets to light, and it's called Lawless Planet. Host Zach Goldbaum reveals how shocking tales of murder, cover-ups, and mysterious deaths are all part of something bigger, the systematic destruction of our planet. From activists who vanish in the Amazon to whistleblowers uncovering billion-dollar environmental crimes, these aren't just stories about the environment. They're real-life thrillers about people caught between powerful forces willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Follow Lawless Planet on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to new episodes of Lawless Planet early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now, or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus.
After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified looking straight down at the ground. Because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom. The exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog, and she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her, and so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sophia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique, and so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sophia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sophia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice, and as Sophia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sophia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped. And all Sophia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sophia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sophia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sophia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sophia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter, because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sophia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sophia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the three friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found. In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland that was being held for them by Kathy's family. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car, which was a dark blue late model 4-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan that initially, when he first pulled in the lot, he believed was empty. But now, as he's looking at it, he can clearly see there are 2 people in the front 2 seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these 2 guys. I mean, they are in this random rest stop in the middle of the night. They're the only ones there, and this guy is just staring menacingly at Mark. And so Mark's doing his best not to be intimidated and to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying his wife comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible so they can get the heck out of here and away from these 2 creepy guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car, hopped in, locked the doors, turned it on, and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged guy, was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-size hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually 2 people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. And so she agreed that was pretty creepy, but by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in on the way to Baltimore in Frederick County, Maryland, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was DC Snipers Caught. It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the 2 men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-size hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Mohammed and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Mohammed was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence.
Our next story is called Rabbit Hole.
On January 1st, 2015, a family in South Yorkshire, England, gathered at a restaurant for their annual New Year's Day lunch. But one member of this family who said they would be attending didn't show up. It was 50-year-old Stephen Winfrey, who was an unemployed, divorced father of two, who in recent years had become quite depressed. When they reached out to him on his phone and he didn't pick up, the family pretty quickly started to worry that something could have happened to him, that, perhaps he did something to harm himself given his mental state. But his sister, Nadine, who was at this lunch, she reassured the rest of the family that she had spoken to Stephen the night before, and he was in great spirits and had told her that his plan was to go rabbit hunting the next day on New Year's Day before heading over to the restaurant for lunch. And because Nadine knew that her brother recently had really taken a liking to rabbit hunting, it was one of the very few things that actually made him happy, she told the family, look, I bet you anything he just lost track of time and he will get here late, or maybe we won't see him at all, but at least he's out doing something that makes him happy. And so the family was reassured by this, and so they sat down at their table, they ordered their food, and the whole meal, everyone's kind of looking over at the front door, expecting Stephen to come strolling in at any minute. But when they finished up eating, he still had not arrived. And so as the family was getting ready to leave the restaurant and head back home, they all decided that, you know what, I'm sure Stephen is fine, he's doing something he loves, I'm sure he did just get carried away, and so we'll just wait for him to contact us. And so the family, they all leave the restaurant and they spend the rest of the day at their respective households. And then the following morning, they all get in touch with each other and they discover that still no one has seen or heard from Stephen. And so at this point, the family just felt like there was something off about this. And so they contacted the police and they reported him missing. As the police were getting ready to head out and begin looking for Stephen that day, they received a call. Stephen had been found. Although the exact details of what happened to Stephen may never be fully understood, this is the best theory that the police have come up with. On New Year's Day, January 1st, the day Stephen was supposed to meet his family for lunch, he had gotten up early and headed out to a nearby forested park to do some rabbit hunting, just like he told his sister he would be. He had gone to the park with his dog and some ferrets. The way Stephen caught rabbits is he would release these ferrets into various rabbit holes, and then he would stand back with his rifle and he would wait for the ferret to run the rabbits out of their holes, out into the open, and then he would raise his rifle and shoot at the rabbits, and then his dog would run over and grab the rabbit and bring it back to him. And so all morning long, he was doing this with relative success, and then something happened to where Stephen decided he needed to actually look inside of one of these rabbit holes. Perhaps one of his ferrets got stuck, or one of the rabbits got stuck, but either way, he wanted to look into the opening of one of these rabbit holes, and so he walked over to it, and apparently he couldn't quite see whatever it was he wanted to see, and so he got down on his hands and knees and stuck his head into this rabbit hole opening. Now, these openings to these rabbit holes are pretty narrow, and so once he forced his head inside, it got stuck. He could not pull it out again. And so all around the outside of this hole where his head was stuck, there were these deep divots that his hands had obviously dug once he realized he was stuck, because he was trying to dig the entrance a little bit wider to get his head out. But as he was working really, really hard and laboring to kind of dig this hole out, he was burning up the very limited amount of oxygen that was inside of this hole. And so very quickly, as he was trying to save himself, he would have started to struggle breathing because there just wasn't enough air in this hole. And so when it became clear he was starting to suffocate, he abandoned the approach of trying to dig himself out and began trying to contort his body outside of the hole at really extreme angles to try to pop his head out. even if it meant breaking his neck in the process. But no matter how hard he tried, he just could not get his head out. The following day, January 2nd at 4 p.m., this is after Stephen has been reported missing, a person walking through that forested park, they found Stephen. They saw his body poking out of that hole at a really extreme angle, and so they called the police. The police showed up to the park, and they confirmed that Stephen was dead. He had suffocated. His death was not ruled a suicide. It was determined to be an accident. As for Stephen's dog and his ferrets, they were found near his body, and they were unhurt.
On February 24th, 2017, 28-year-old Shannon Graves sat on the couch watching TV with her boyfriend in her apartment in Youngstown, Ohio. Shannon changed the channel, and right away she could see that her boyfriend, who was a man in his early 30s named Arturo Novoa, looked annoyed by what she wanted to watch, so she flipped the channel to something else. Then Shannon glanced over at Arturo, but he still looked annoyed. Shannon sighed, trying her best to keep her cool. It was not that long ago that sitting on the couch with Arturo would have made for a relaxing evening at home. But now, every time the two were around each other, they just seemed to argue about everything, even meaningless stuff like what to watch on TV. Shannon put the remote down and then leaned back on the couch and didn't say anything. She hoped that maybe if she just sat there in silence, they could avoid a fight. But in reality, Shannon knew that this TV show she chose, or whatever little thing they ended up arguing about next, was actually just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Her and Arturo's relationship was clearly falling apart. The two of them met almost a year earlier at the club where Shannon had been working nights as a dancer while she went to classes during the day to earn her cosmetology degree. And despite their obvious differences, at first they had gotten along great. Shannon was outgoing and always seemed to be on the move, while Arturo was quiet and more reserved. But they thought their differences actually complemented each other really well. So, after dating for only a few months, Shannon and Arturo moved into an apartment together. And that's when things started to go bad. It was like right away, they just both stopped trusting each other. Arturo accused Shannon of still being into her ex-boyfriend, a guy she'd actually been living with before she met Arturo, and Shannon was convinced that Arturo had a thing for this woman who was always hanging around him when he would come to see Shannon at the club. But whether or not those things were true, Shannon knew her issues with the relationship ran deeper than just thinking Arturo might like some other girl. Shannon had always been someone who loved change. She just never wanted to feel stuck. And so to avoid that feeling, she would often do things like dye her long black hair green and blue, or she'd take much bigger steps like she would occasionally just leave town for weeks at a time to go on an adventure by herself without telling anyone where she was. But living with Arturo had definitely made Shannon feel stuck. And over the last few months, that feeling had really worn her down. Back in the apartment, Shannon eventually just stood up from the couch and began to walk out of the room. But as she did, Arturo snapped at her for some reason, and then before long, the two of them were just yelling at each other. And the argument escalated, even though neither of them really knew what they were even fighting about. Until finally, Arturo said, maybe he should just leave for good. And then he stormed out. Shannon stood there in her apartment for a minute, trying to catch her breath and calm down. She was mad, but she also couldn't help but feel this sense of relief. If Arturo was gone, like really gone, she could now do anything she wanted. She could make a change. She could go someplace new. A few months earlier, Shannon had finally earned her cosmetology degree. She had worked really hard for it, and she was proud of herself. Some people had been surprised because they thought getting a degree sort of went against Shannon's need for constant change, but Shannon saw things differently. Her degree could open doors and give her a chance to work as a cosmetologist in different cities. Or maybe she could even become a highly sought-after makeup artist who would get to travel all over the world. But Arturo had never really supported her dreams, so she had kind of given up on them. Now, she could start putting her degree and her talents to work, and she would not have to do that in Youngstown, Ohio. And just thinking about the possibilities for the future got her really excited. Shannon walked to the bathroom, got undressed, and turned on the shower. In her mind, she would wash off all the bad stuff that had happened recently, and it would be like the first small step towards a fresh start. On June 22, 2017, so 4 months after Shannon and Arturo had their big fight, Detective Mike Lambert of the Youngstown Police Department looked up from his desk, and he saw a uniformed police officer standing there with a woman who looked very pale and worried. Detective Lambert asked how he could help. The woman said her name was Debbie DePaul, and she needed to file a missing persons report. She said that nobody had seen or talked to her younger half-sister, Shannon Graves, in 4 months. A confused look came across Lambert's face, and for a second he thought he must have misheard her. And so he asked her again, how long has it been since anybody talked to your half-sister? And Debbie repeated herself and said again it had been 4 months. This blew Lambert away. In all his time as a detective, he'd seen family and friends typically file missing persons report, if anything, too soon, like before they really needed to. Not 4 months after the fact. In fact, in the majority of cases he'd worked, the supposed missing person had turned up before the cops could even launch a real search. So he really couldn't understand why Debbie, or anyone else close to Shannon, had waited this long to talk to the police. Lambert told the other officer he could leave, and he asked Debbie to take a seat and walk him through what was going on here. After the officer left, Debbie sat down and said she knew how strange it must sound that she had waited this long. But if Lambert knew her sister Shannon, it would make way more sense. She said that Shannon had a history of just sort of taking off and not talking to anyone for long periods of time. It was something she'd done since she was a teenager. And as difficult as it was to deal with that, Shannon's friends and family had sort of come to accept it about her. It was one of the things that made Shannon who she was. But now, they noticed that Shannon had not called on a couple of family birthdays, and she also hadn't checked in when her best friend had a baby, and that was not like Shannon at all. Even when she went away without telling anyone, she would always call on these important days. Detective Lambert didn't say this, but he knew 4 months might as well have been an eternity when it came to a missing persons case. If Shannon had really left town like her sister claimed she liked to do, well, Shannon could be anywhere in the world by now. But Lambert figured he would just start his investigation the same way he would if Shannon had only been missing for a few days. So he took down information about Shannon's physical appearance, her last known address, and the places she had worked. He also learned small details like Shannon's favorite color was pink, and she loved wearing friendship bracelets. And so after only speaking to Debbie for a few minutes, Detective Lambert had a pretty good picture of who Shannon was. But he had one more question. He asked Debbie if Shannon had a romantic partner. Debbie said yes, Shannon had a boyfriend, or at least she did the last time they had spoken. She had been living with a guy named Arturo Novoa, and Shannon had told Debbie that she and Arturo fought all the time. The following day, Detective Lambert sat down with Arturo in a small interview room at the station. Lambert had looked into Arturo the night before. He knew Arturo had a couple of minor run-ins with the police, but nothing big, and he had no record of violent crimes or anything like that. So Lambert really just hoped that Arturo knew where Shannon was, or at least had heard from her over the past 4 months, and also, if he hadn't, he hoped to get a good idea of what Arturo and Shannon's relationship had been like. But when Lambert asked Arturo when he'd last seen or talked to Shannon, Arturo seemed surprised by the question. He said he'd already told all this to Shannon's family when they'd called him like a month or so earlier. He said he and Shannon had broken up back in February. He admitted that things ended pretty badly, so they had not spoken to each other since. The last he'd heard, Shannon was living with some guy in Cleveland, which was over an hour away from Youngstown. Arturo didn't know the name of the man that Shannon was supposedly living with, so he really couldn't provide much more color than he already had. And so Lambert wrapped up their conversation soon after that, and then he reached out to Shannon's sister, Debbie, to see if she knew of any men, other than Arturo, that Shannon could possibly be with. Debbie said before Shannon had started dating Arturo, she'd been in a serious relationship with a man named John Scarata. Just hearing that name shocked Lambert, and it caused him to immediately begin planning his next move, because he knew John Scarata all too well. John had a substantial criminal history. In fact, he had done time in prison on drug charges, and Lambert knew that John had gotten out of prison right around the last time anyone had seen Shannon. After speaking to Debbie, Detective Lambert got to work right away tracking down John. And it would turn out he was not in Cleveland. He was in Youngstown, trying to get his life together after getting out of prison. The following day, when John Scarratta walked into the interview room at the station, he greeted Detective Lambert like they were old friends. And when the detective brought up Shannon, John didn't seem surprised at all. He said he'd learned Shannon had disappeared not long after he'd gotten out of prison. So Lambert asked if he was worried about her. And John, in response to this, did something that Lambert did not see coming at all. John leaned forward in his chair and said yes, he was really worried. In fact, he was so worried, he'd started his own investigation. Lambert was so caught off guard by this that he didn't really know how to react. What did John mean he was doing his own investigation? But just then, John grabbed his phone out of his pocket, pulled up his photos, and showed them to Lambert. And Lambert saw multiple pictures of different cars that had been parked right outside of Shannon's apartment over the past few months. John had staked out the place, looking for Shannon or for anything or anyone that seemed out of the ordinary. Lambert felt a little conflicted. He believed if something bad had happened to Shannon, John had to be a major suspect here. But he couldn't deny that he did want to track down all of these cars John had photographed at Shannon's apartment. So ultimately, Lambert did get the license plate numbers of all the cars, and he told John to stop staking out Shannon's place and to just let the police do their jobs. John said he totally understood. He just wanted to find Shannon and make sure she was okay. Detective Lambert knew John had connections to the criminal world of Youngstown, Ohio, so there really was a chance that John thought he was the best person to find Shannon, a woman he claimed to still be in love with. But there was also a chance that John was just trying to send the police on some kind of wild goose chase to keep them off of his trail, because maybe he had something to do with what happened to Shannon. So, in the days following their meeting, Lambert and his team tried to get a clear picture of everywhere John had been since he'd gotten out of prison, and if he'd had any communication with Shannon near the time she'd supposedly disappeared. Police also questioned Shannon's friends, her family, and her coworkers at the nightclub, and they also followed up on all those cars John had photographed. But for Shannon's half-sister Debbie, the police were not moving fast enough. She now believed that she and her family had waited way too long to get the cops involved, and so she felt like she had to do something to make up for that. So, in late June, about a week after she had filed the missing persons report, Debbie knocked on the door of a house in Youngstown that looked pretty much like all the other houses around it, except for the sign in the window that advertised psychic readings. A woman with a soft smile opened the door and led Debbie down a hallway to a small dark room. The woman told Debbie she was a psychic medium, which meant she claimed to be able to communicate with spirits or the deceased, and then was able to relay their messages to the living. Debbie sat down at a table with the medium and described Shannon and talked about how she'd been missing for months. The medium closed her eyes and listened carefully, and after a moment, she told Debbie she could see something: a bridge. Now, this medium didn't know exactly which bridge this was, but she was sure it was not far away from here. And somehow, this bridge had to be connected to Shannon's disappearance. Debbie left the medium's house and immediately called a friend of hers and told her what the medium had said. And both women decided it was clear what they had to do next. They would have to search every bridge in Youngstown, Ohio. And so for the next couple of weeks, Debbie and her friend went around town visiting every bridge they could find. And it started to feel like a waste of time. That is, until one afternoon when Debbie and her friend approached a small bridge that neither of them had driven on before. As they stepped out of the car, they saw something laying on the ground near the base of one of the bridge's girders. When Debbie walked over to it and knelt down to get a better look, she almost started crying. Because there, laying on the ground, were saw blades, a rope, and a pink sock. Debbie and her friend took pictures of the objects and then drove straight to the police station. Debbie told Detective Lambert about the medium's vision and showed him the photos of what they'd found at the bridge. Lambert had learned from Debbie when they first met that Shannon's favorite color was pink, and that she loved wearing pink clothes. He couldn't just ignore saw blades and a rope being found out in the middle of nowhere next to a pink sock. So, the detective told Debbie that he and his team would look into it right away. But as Lambert headed out to this bridge, he started to feel like this case was getting away from him. He was already dealing with the missing woman's ex-boyfriend conducting his own investigation, and now he was following up on a lead that apparently came from a psychic medium. And Lambert still had no idea what had happened to Shannon. She really could just be in Cleveland or anywhere else, purposefully avoiding her friends and family. Or she could be the victim of a horrible crime. One way or the other, Lambert needed some piece of concrete evidence to point him in the right direction. And while he didn't want to rule anything out, he doubted that that piece of evidence was going to come from a psychic vision. About a month later, on the afternoon of July 29th, a woman was making Italian food at her house in a small town just a few miles from Youngstown. As she cooked, she looked down at the food she was making, and suddenly she got mad at herself. She realized she didn't have enough meat to make the meatballs she was planning to serve with this meal. She thought about taking a quick trip to the grocery store, but then she remembered something. So she called out to her husband in the next room and told him to keep an eye on the stove. She left the kitchen and walked down a set of old wooden steps into the basement. She passed by their washer and dryer and walked over to a white, rectangle-shaped chest freezer that was standing up against the wall. Now, this woman knew there was meat inside this freezer, and she could use it to make her meatballs. But there was a problem. The freezer had a padlock on it. But the woman was undeterred. She grabbed a nearby screwdriver off a work table and used it to pry the entire metal latch that the lock was connected to off the freezer. And so now, with the freezer unlocked, the woman opened it up, and immediately she began to scream. At about 5:30 that afternoon, 2 hours after that woman had looked inside the freezer, crime scene investigator Tony Marzullo walked down the stairs into the married couple's basement. Marzullo worked out of Youngstown, but he helped in the surrounding smaller towns when he was needed. And today, he'd gotten one of the strangest calls he'd ever received from police dispatch in one of those smaller towns. Marzullo put on his gloves and approached the freezer. The freezer door was still open, and he could see inside of the freezer was an orange plastic bucket with trash bags sticking out of it. Marzullo got closer and leaned over the freezer and looked inside of that bucket. And the instant he did, he reflexively put his hand over his mouth and tried to collect himself. Even the call from dispatch had not prepared him for this. Because in the bucket, Marzullo was looking at the top half of a frozen, severed human head. Marzullo looked down deeper into the freezer, and he saw the entire thing was basically filled with trash bags. And as he pulled out each of these bags and looked inside of them, he found human legs, human arms, and human hands. Marzullo had no idea who the victim was, but instinctively, he grabbed his phone and called Detective Lambert. Later that evening, Detective Lambert stood in the basement with Marzullo and a group of police officers and forensic technicians. Like Lambert had expected, the psychic vision and the objects found at that bridge had not given him any new leads in Shannon's case, and neither had any of the interviews Lambert had conducted to this point. Basically, the case had stalled. He had no idea where Shannon was or what happened to her. But now, as he stood over the freezer, he had a sinking feeling that the body he was looking at could be hers. Now, they would need to run some tests to officially identify the body, but Marzullo was very confident they could do that quickly. Forensic techs would allow the severed hands they'd found to defrost. Then they would use a saline solution to rehydrate the fingers on those hands, which would allow them to pull clean fingerprints. While Lambert waited for those results, he interviewed the married couple who lived at the house to try to figure out how a dismembered body had wound up in their basement. The couple proved to be extremely cooperative. They said that freezer was not theirs. A friend had asked to store it in their house because the electricity in his house had been cut off, and he didn't want the meat in the freezer to go bad. When their friend had brought it over, they did think it was odd that the freezer had a padlock on it, but they'd assumed the freezer door just didn't stay shut on its own, so their friend must have locked it just to make sure the meat inside stayed frozen. The woman went on to tell Lambert that the only reason she had broken into the freezer is because she really wanted to make meatballs. Lambert thought the story was definitely strange, but none of it sounded untrue. So he asked who was this friend who gave them the freezer. They said his name was Anthony Gonzalez, but he was trying to become a hip-hop star, so sometimes he went by the name Tony G. That night, Lambert began his search for Anthony Gonzalez, aka Tony G. But despite it seeming like a pretty common name, he could not find a single Anthony Gonzalez living in Youngstown. And before Lambert could expand his search for Anthony to nearby towns, he got a call from Marzullo. Marzullo told him the lab had successfully pulled fingerprints from the now defrosted hands they'd found, and they were able to officially identify the victim. The body in the freezer was Shannon Graves. Now that police had finally found Shannon's body, and this had become a homicide investigation, news of the grisly discovery in the basement spread across Youngstown. And in the days following the discovery, Detective Lambert got an unexpected visitor at the station. Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, had returned. John had heard about Shannon's body, and he admitted right off the bat to Detective Lambert that despite what he'd promised him, he said he had not actually given up his own investigation into Shannon's case. And in fact, now he had discovered something huge. John heard from a friend of his about a house party that had taken place a few months earlier. And at this house party, a man named Andrew Herman had been burning some of Shannon's stuff in a huge bonfire. With help from John, Detective Lambert and several other investigators found their way to the house where this party had taken place. And as soon as they got out of their cars, they could see the remnants of a bonfire in the front yard. There was a big pit filled with ashes and big pieces of wood around it that looked like they'd been used for seating. Lambert and a crime scene investigator walked across the dying grass in the front yard. They put on their gloves and began sifting through the large pile of ashes. And they found what looked like charred clothing and some burned pieces of plastic. But to their utter shock, it looked like one object had survived the fire and remained almost perfectly preserved. And as Lambert bent down and pulled this object out of the ashes, he almost couldn't believe it. Because of all the possible things he could have found, this was like the perfect clue. The object was a friendship bracelet with small plastic beads strung on it that spelled out Shannon. There was no doubt that John had been right. Somebody had been burning Shannon's things. Investigators headed back to the station with this new piece of evidence, and Lambert set up a meeting with Andrew Herman, the man John said had been burning Shannon's things. But John warned Lambert to watch out, because Andrew was a total psychopath. A guy who was into black magic and who worshipped the serial killer cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer. On August 7th, 2017, so about a week and a half after the discovery of Shannon's body, Detective Lambert led Andrew into an interview room. And Lambert had to admit that Andrew was not anything like what he'd expected. Andrew wore a well-fitted suit and tie, and his hair was short and neatly combed. He looked way more like a guy who worked at a bank than somebody who was into black magic and serial killers. But Lambert knew the way this guy was dressing didn't prove anything, one way or another. Detective Lambert told Andrew right away that they had gone to the site of the house party and discovered a friendship bracelet inside of a fire pit that they were sure belonged to Shannon Graves, and that they'd heard Andrew was the one trying to burn it. Andrew nodded and said, yep, the bracelet was Shannon's, and he was trying to burn it. And he also admitted that he and a couple other people had also burned some of Shannon's other things at that party. Lambert just looked at him and said it seemed very suspicious that they had burned the belongings of a woman who'd recently been found brutally murdered. But Andrew did not flinch. In a perfectly calm voice, he said they had burned the stuff as a favor for a friend, Anthony Gonzalez. Now, Detective Lambert did not react to what he was hearing, but inside, after hearing that name, he felt like he was about to lock up this investigation. Because he was now able to connect Anthony, aka Tony G., the man who'd brought the freezer to the married couple's basement, directly to the bonfire that had been used to get rid of Shannon's personal belongings. So Lambert asked why his friend, Anthony, had wanted to burn Shannon's stuff in the first place. Andrew sat there in silence for a minute, and then he began to speak. And when he did, without ever losing his cool, he told a story that was even gorier and more disturbing than any story Detective Lambert had ever heard in his life. And by the time Andrew stopped telling this story, Lambert knew exactly what had happened to Shannon Graves. The killer walked through Shannon's apartment, breathing heavily and clutching a hammer in their hand. They could hear the shower running, so they headed for the bathroom. Once there, they opened the door and stepped inside. Shannon shouted something and pulled back the shower curtain, but before she could even figure out what was happening, the killer raised the hammer and slammed it into the top of her head. Shannon's body collapsed in the shower, and blood began to run into the drain. As for the killer, they continued to swing the hammer over and over again into Shannon's head. Her body twitched and then eventually stopped moving. She was dead in the shower. The killer turned off the water and just stood there for a second, staring down at what they'd done. And for the first time, they realized that killing Shannon was actually just the beginning. Now they had to get rid of her body. The killer rushed to the kitchen, found trash bags, and came right back. They opened up a bathroom cabinet, grabbed an electric razor, and turned it on. Then they leaned into the shower and shaved Shannon's head, believing this would help disguise her identity. When they were finished, the killer put the razor back, opened one of the trash bags, and awkwardly pulled Shannon's body out of the shower onto the bathroom floor. They tried to stuff Shannon into the trash bag, but quickly realized that was never going to work. So they tried to wrap the trash bag around her, but that failed too. The bag just wasn't big enough. The killer started to panic. They knew they had not thought this through. So they grabbed their phone and called their girlfriend. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The killer opened it and quickly led their girlfriend into the bathroom and showed her Shannon's body. The girlfriend did her best to stay calm. She said after dark, they could move Shannon's body to her place and figure out what to do with it from there. So the killer and their girlfriend spent a couple of hours in Shannon's apartment just kind of waiting around with Shannon's dead body only a few feet away. Not long after sunset, the killer and the girlfriend grabbed Shannon's clothes off the bathroom floor, they took her purse, and then did their best to wrap Shannon's body up in trash bags. Then they carried her body and her belongings out into the darkness and put everything into the trunk of the girlfriend's car. They drove to the girlfriend's house and brought Shannon's body inside and laid it in the bathtub. Then the killer called the one friend they thought could help. And later that night, that friend arrived with a fully formed plan and a machete. The killer, the girlfriend, and the friend of the killer spent the entire night dismembering Shannon's body. At some point, the friend told the killer to order sulfuric acid online and to set up a delivery at a bulk store nearby. In the meantime, the friend gathered up all of Shannon's stuff the group had in their possession and went to a house party, where they knew there was going to be a big bonfire, and they burned everything. Not long after that, the sulfuric acid arrived at the bulk store. Killer picked it up, and the three of them covered the now dismembered body parts in the sulfuric acid, hoping to melt Shannon's skin down to the bone. But they soon discovered a problem. In an effort to save money, the killer had bought off-brand sulfuric acid, and it just was not doing the trick. Large parts of Shannon's body were disintegrating in the acid, but not all of it was. So the friend took the machete and started hacking away even more at Shannon's body, while the killer went out and bought a chest freezer. And eventually, the three of them were able to get Shannon's body parts into trash bags and a bucket, and they crammed all of that into the freezer and locked it. And at that point, the killer's friend, who made a point of studying serial killers, believed they had completely covered their tracks. Andrew Herman, the man who supposedly worshipped Jeffrey Dahmer, oversaw the disposal of Shannon's body and her belongings. And his friend, Anthony Gonzalez, who also went by his hip-hop name Tony G, murdered Shannon. But it would turn out Anthony Gonzalez and Tony G, those two names, were both aliases. Anthony, aka Tony G, was actually Shannon's boyfriend, Arturo Novoa. On the night that he and Shannon had fought and he stormed out, Arturo did not leave for good. Instead, he came back, grabbed a hammer, and killed Shannon. But Arturo had not thought the murder through. So after it was done, he called his other girlfriend, the woman who Shannon had seen him hanging around with at the nightclub, for help. This girlfriend, who knew Arturo by his alias, Anthony Gonzalez, was very devoted to him and was willing to do whatever it took to protect him, which is why she was willing to help dispose of Shannon's body. Police had considered Arturo a suspect, and when they interviewed him after the missing persons report was filed, Arturo worried they would start closing in. So he had taken the freezer with Shannon's body in it to the house of a married couple he knew. He told them he had no electricity at his place and asked them to store the freezer so the meat wouldn't go bad. And they agreed. After the discovery of Shannon's body in their basement, police had begun to look for Anthony Gonzalez, which the married couple believed was their friend's real name who owned the freezer. But it was when the couple showed the police a picture of Anthony that the police knew they were onto something. Because they could tell the photo was not of Anthony. The photo was of Arturo. And finally, Shannon's ex-boyfriend, John, who had his own investigation, helped Detective Lambert solidify his case. When John led Lambert to the remnants of the bonfire and Shannon's friendship bracelet, it allowed Lambert to bring in Andrew for questioning, because that's who John said was burning all the stuff. And Andrew, when he was interviewed, just told Detective Lambert all about the horrors that had taken place from the moment Arturo killed Shannon until the moment the freezer ended up in the married couple's basement. Arturo was ultimately sentenced to 48 years to life in prison. His girlfriend was sentenced to 18 years for her role in the crime, and Andrew was sentenced to 12 years. On June 7, 2007, 48-year-old Bob Eidman sat at his desk across from a client at the small auto insurance company he owned in St. Charles, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Bob and his client talked like they were old friends. That was how Bob was with all of his clients. Part of the reason for this was that Bob just loved talking to people. But he also knew that a lot of his clients came to him when they had no other option, and they were often stressed out about making car insurance payments, so he tried hard to put them at ease. Bob went out of his way to work with people who had bad credit, or a history of traffic violations, or maybe who had gotten a DUI. These were people who desperately needed auto insurance because without it they couldn't drive, but they simply couldn't get insured by larger companies. Bob was well aware of this and made sure he never ever took advantage of these people's desperation. Instead, he offered affordable rates, accepted cash payments, and worked with clients to come up with insurance plans that they could actually handle. And so because of this, Bob had gotten a reputation in town as being as much a benefactor as he was a businessman. In the office, Bob's client handed him an envelope of cash to cover her payment for the month. They talked a bit longer, and then the client left. Once the door was closed, Bob marked the payment in his books, opened a desk drawer where he kept his cash hidden, and tucked the money inside. After that, he looked down at his phone and realized it was later than he thought. So he quickly grabbed a stack of business cards off his desk, slipped them in his pocket, and walked out. Bob's office was on the second floor of a strip mall. So once he was outside, he walked right down the steps to the parking lot, got in his car, and pulled out onto the street. Even though St. Charles was only about 30 minutes from the major city of St. Louis, it felt like a small town. This was a place where a lot of residents kept their doors unlocked and even left their keys in their cars. As Bob drove, he saw loads of people outside enjoying the beautiful spring weather and walking along the Missouri River that wound its way through St. Charles. Bob was a member of the St. Charles Chamber of Commerce, so he loved seeing people taking advantage of the natural beauty the town had to offer. And as an active member of the community, he really believed this was the kind of place where someone could help others and still succeed in business. A few minutes later, Bob pulled into the parking lot of a car dealership in town, and when he did, he got a huge smile on his face, because he saw his wife Diane standing outside the showroom waiting for him. So Bob parked his car, hopped outside, and walked right over to his wife and gave her a kiss on the cheek. The two had been married for 28 years, but they'd only started working together about a year ago when Bob opened up his insurance business. And people who knew them thought they complemented each other perfectly. Bob was this big guy with messy gray hair who loved to talk, while Diane looked and acted like a total professional. And even though they went about things differently, they shared a drive and an appreciation for hard work. In fact, Diane had a full-time job at a hospital, but she still managed to carve out a few hours almost every day to help her husband in his office or to do some marketing for the insurance company, which is actually why they were there at the car dealership. Bob handed Diane half of the business cards he'd brought, and then the two of them split up and began talking to everyone at the dealership who might be looking for a new car. This was one of the ways they marketed Bob's company and found new clients. The two of them spent the rest of the day handing out cards and talking to people. By the time they were finished, they were worn out, but they felt like they'd put in a good, honest day of work. That night, back at home, Bob stayed up and brainstormed more possible marketing ideas, while Diane went to bed early. She had to be up and out of the house by 5 a.m. the next day to make her shift at the hospital. Bob knew how hard it had been for Diane, working basically non-stop across multiple jobs, but he told himself this would all be worth it. The risk he had taken by opening up his own business would eventually pay off, he knew it. Then he'd be able to give Diane a happier, easier life. At 10 a.m. the following day, June 8th, Bob walked into his office, went to his desk, and got right to work, going over his financial statements and planning client meetings. And he'd been working for about an hour when he heard the office door open. So he stopped what he was doing, and he looked up from his desk. At 12:30 p.m., so 2.5 hours after Bob had gotten to the office, a postal worker was making her daily rounds through the same strip mall. She delivered mail to all the businesses on the first floor and then headed upstairs to drop a package off for Bob. She opened Bob's door, said hello as she walked in, and then stopped cold right inside the doorway. She began to scream, dropped the package on the ground, and ran back down the stairs, yelling for help. People began coming out of their shops and offices to see what was going on. At the same time, this postal worker just happened to spot a police cruiser coming down the street towards the strip mall, so she sprinted across the parking lot and ran out into the road, shouting and waving her arms to get their attention. The police cruiser came to a screeching halt, and an officer got out and asked her what was wrong. And the postal worker, who could barely breathe, began to describe what she had just seen. A moment later, that same police officer was entering Bob's office, and just like the postal worker had done, the officer froze in the office doorway. He had been on the force for years, but what he saw in the office still hit him hard. Because on the floor right in front of him, Bob lay motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood. The officer quickly pulled himself together, ran across the office, and crouched down over Bob's body. He checked for a pulse, but it was clear Bob was dead. Not long after the officer contacted the station to report the death, Detective Donald Stepp of the St. Charles Police and his superior, Captain Pat McCarrick, arrived at the scene. These were two of the most experienced investigators on the force, but even they had not had to deal with many homicides in St. Charles. Because, at the time, the city had a far lower murder rate than the state of Missouri and the country as a whole. Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick did a walkthrough of the office, and then they examined Bob's body. They saw multiple bullet wounds, but one of the shots looked like it had just grazed Bob. Stepp and McCarrick also found spent shell casings and also live rounds from a 9mm handgun spread out at different spots across the floor. Because of these live rounds on the floor, which are just unshot bullets, so intact, full live rounds, the investigators thought the killer's weapon might have jammed at some point, and so maybe in an attempt to clear the jam, they had ejected these live rounds onto the ground. Or perhaps the killer might have just been an inexperienced shooter and sort of unintentionally ejected these live rounds without shooting them. The investigators dug through Bob's desk, and they noticed there was no sign of a wallet or any form of ID. They checked Bob's pockets and didn't find a wallet there either, so they thought maybe this had been a robbery. But not long after that, they discovered the money in Bob's cash drawer. They didn't know why a robber would have taken Bob's wallet and left all this cash behind. But maybe there was a chance that the killer was not only an inexperienced shooter, but also an inexperienced thief. Soon, the investigators were joined by members of the county forensic team. Forensics officers examined and collected the shell casings as well as the live rounds. They dusted for prints and did a thorough search of Bob's body and clothes for possible DNA samples. While the forensics team worked in the office, Stepp and McCarrick made their way outside and began questioning owners and employees from the other businesses in the strip mall. The woman who owned the printing shop right below Bob's office proved to be the most helpful. She told investigators she had seen Bob pull into the parking lot around 10 a.m. And at about 11, she said she'd heard loud banging coming from upstairs in Bob's office. She said that she figured Bob was just moving file cabinets around or something, and as a joke, she'd even yelled up to him from her office, "Hey Bob, keep the noise down." But now that she knew what had really happened to Bob, she wished at the time she heard those noises, she had gone upstairs to check on him. The investigators asked her if she could think of anyone who might have had an issue with Bob, but the woman said no, Bob was one of the most likable people she knew, and she figured everyone the police would talk to would say the same thing, because that's just who Bob was. A few minutes later, as the investigators walked out of the print shop, Detective Stepp scanned the strip mall, and the front door of a Mexican restaurant caught his attention. Positioned right above the restaurant door was a security camera that pointed out towards the parking lot and the street. So the investigators went inside the restaurant and asked the owner if they could have his surveillance footage from that morning and also the night before. The owner said of course, and handed over the footage. By the time the investigators had spoken to everyone in the strip mall, it was about 3 p.m. Around that time, Stepp and McCarrick headed towards the stairs to rejoin the forensics team inside of Bob's office. But as they were walking, they heard an officer shouting their names from the parking lot. They turned around and saw the officer standing there with a woman, and as they made eye contact with this officer, he quickly came over to them. He said the woman he was with was Bob's wife, Diane. She'd been trying to get a hold of Bob, but he never answered, so she came up here to see if everything was okay. He said Diane obviously knew something was going on here because of the police presence, but she didn't actually know what had happened to Bob. Detective Stepp took a breath, and then he and his captain went to go speak with Diane. They introduced themselves, and then Stepp broke the news that her husband had been found dead in his office, and that someone had shot him. Then Stepp and McCarrick offered their condolences. But Diane's response took them completely by surprise. Diane barely reacted at all, and she didn't even say anything. Now, the investigators knew that people handled news like this in very different ways, but neither of them had ever seen something like this. It was like Diane was completely devoid of emotion. Stepp and McCarrick shared a quick look, and it was clear they both thought this was strange. But they were experienced enough not to jump to conclusions based on a single reaction or non-reaction from somebody who just heard such terrible news. Stepp broke the silence and told Diane they'd like to ask her some questions so they could try to figure out, where to start this investigation. Diane finally spoke and said she would help if she could. Stepp called over to the officer who had brought them Diane and asked him to go get them a chair. The officer ducked into one of the offices and quickly came back out again with a metal folding chair and placed it down next to Diane. Diane took a seat right there in the parking lot, and then Stepp and McCarrick began questioning her. As the victim's spouse, Diane was automatically a person of interest. So the investigators started with basic questions about her and Bob's marriage. How was their marriage going lately? Did they fight? Did they have financial problems? But Diane said she and Bob had a great relationship. They fought like any married couple would, but it was nothing serious. She said financially they were fine. And with Bob's growing business, they actually hoped to be in even better shape financially soon. Without missing a beat, Captain McCarrick asked if Bob had a life insurance policy, and if so, was Diane the beneficiary? This was a pretty standard question in this situation when dealing with a victim's spouse or children, because somebody killing a family member to collect the life insurance policy was definitely not unheard of. Diane said yes, Bob had life insurance, and she was the beneficiary, but it was a small policy. The payout was maybe $5,000. Now, immediately, neither of the investigators thought that was enough money for somebody to want to kill over, but they didn't want to rule anything out yet. At some point, Detective Stepp asked Diane if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Bob, and he sort of expected her answer to be similar to the one the print shop owner had given. But Diane's answer was very different. She said she did know somebody. There was a man who might have it out for Bob. She said his name was Kevin Green, and he was a rival auto insurance salesman in town. Bob had recently accused Kevin of stealing one of his clients and had actually gone to Kevin's office to confront him about it. After jotting down Kevin's name, Stepp asked Diane one more question. Did Bob usually carry cash on him? Diane nodded. She said he always had a good amount of cash in his wallet, and he always carried his wallet in his back pocket, even when he was sitting at his desk. After speaking to Diane, Stepp and McCarrick returned to Bob's office, where forensics officers were still working. Bob's missing wallet meant that his murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad, like they'd thought. And so they shared the information about Bob always carrying his wallet in his back pocket with the forensics team. After hearing this, one of the forensics officers walked over to Bob's body, crouched down, and studied the back pocket of his pants. She said she would cut away the pocket from the pants and keep it as a potential source for a DNA sample. Upon hearing this, Stepp and McCarrick looked confused. DNA samples could only be taken from bodily fluids, and unless they were missing something, it did not look like the pocket had any fluids on it. The forensics officer saw their looks and told them that this was sort of a long shot, but DNA testing technology was making huge advances very quickly. So maybe, down the line, they might be able to pull something useful from that back pocket, despite there not being any obvious fluids on it. Now, Stepp and McCarrick would love it if that wound up being the case, but there was obviously no way they could count on that. So, in the meantime, they decided to start with the one person Bob might have had a beef with, Kevin Green, the rival insurance salesman. Several hours after Bob's body had been discovered, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick walked into another small auto insurance office in St. Charles. And there, they found Kevin Green working at his desk. Kevin smiled warmly and then asked how he could help, almost like he might try to sell them something. But when they told him that Bob Eidman had been murdered, Kevin's smile quickly disappeared and he looked genuinely shocked. The investigators laid out their reason for being there. They knew that Kevin and Bob were rivals and that Bob had recently confronted him about stealing clients. But Kevin just shook his head and said it was not like that at all. He and Bob did not have a confrontation. They just spoke, and there was no rivalry, at least not how the detectives were making it sound. He said that he and Bob were competitors, but they were cordial with each other and actually seemed to get along just fine. Stepp asked Kevin if he could give them a timeline of how he'd spent his day. Kevin nodded and said he'd just gone shopping that morning at a sporting goods store, and then after that, he'd come into work. After taking down some notes, Stepp nodded and said they would be in touch if they needed anything else. Then the two investigators left. In the days immediately following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick got members of their team to begin to follow up on Kevin's alibi. As for the two of them, they began to focus on the theory that Bob's murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad. If that was the case, they knew they could be looking for anyone off the streets, but they hoped that the surveillance camera footage they had gotten from the Mexican restaurant would help make the search a whole lot easier. So, Stepp, McCarrick, and another member of their team began the painstaking process of sitting in a cramped office and watching the grainy video footage frame by frame. And after only doing this for a short time, everything on the screen began to look like a blur of black and white, and it was hard to even make things out clearly. But suddenly, as Stepp was staring at the monitor, he thought he saw something, and it was like he had just suddenly woken up. He told the officer they were working with to rewind the footage several minutes back. The officer did, and then all three of them leaned into the screen and watched. And this time, McCarrick and the other officer saw what Stepp had seen. The same car, a Ford Focus, drove slowly through the strip mall parking lot twice within the span of a few minutes on the day of the murder. It sort of looked like the driver was staking out the place. And the final time the car drove through the lot before disappearing from the footage was about 11 a.m. And that was right around the time the owner of the print shop had heard all that noise coming from Bob's office right above her, and just about 90 minutes before Bob's body had been discovered. Unfortunately, the car's license plates weren't visible on the footage, and so Stepp and McCarrick knew that that would make their jobs a whole lot harder. Still, they had a brand new lead here, and that was exciting. So they had members of their team compile a list of every registered Ford Focus in the county and told them to start tracking down each of the owners. They also set up roadblocks in St. Charles in the hope that the Ford Focus in question might end up at one. Stepp and McCarrick knew that finding this car from the footage could take a long time. After all, there were a lot of Ford Focuses to check, and there was no guarantee the one they wanted was registered in this county. So while the search for the Ford Focus got underway, the two investigators turned their attention back to the one suspect neither of them could get out of their minds, Bob's wife, Diane. During the week following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick began digging deeper into Bob's relationship with his wife. They knew that Diane's strange and sort of cold reaction to the news of her husband's death did not necessarily mean she was guilty, but they just couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about her. So they reached out to Bob's cell phone carrier to secure his phone records, and they also started looking into Bob and Diane's finances. And it didn't take them long to discover that Diane had lied to them. Stepp and McCarrick learned that the couple was not doing well financially, like Diane had suggested. Starting and operating the insurance company had put Bob in significant debt. So much debt, in fact, that he had been in jeopardy of losing his business. But that wasn't even the biggest thing that jumped out at the investigators. They got more information on Bob's life insurance. The policy Diane had told them was worth just $5,000. And they learned that, in fact, Bob had 3 life insurance policies that collectively were worth a total of $400,000, and Diane would get all of it with Bob dead. On June 20th, so almost 2 weeks after the murder, Stepp and McCarrick sat across from Diane in an interview room at the St. Charles police station, and they did not waste any time skirting the issue. Stepp said they knew Diane had lied to them about her and Bob's financial situation. And perhaps even more importantly, they knew she had also lied about the amount of money she would receive from Bob's life insurance. Diane stayed calm and quiet, like she had when the investigators interviewed her the first time. She said she had lied about her and Bob's financial situation for one simple reason: she was embarrassed. This response actually didn't surprise Stepp and McCarrick. A lot of people do not feel comfortable talking about money problems, even to police conducting a very serious investigation. But Stepp didn't back off. He said Diane's response did not fully explain their issue, because it didn't explain why she'd lied about Bob's life insurance. What does that have to do with being embarrassed? But all Diane could say was she didn't realize the payout was as big as it was. Stepp and McCarrick did not quite buy it, and so they asked Diane to take a polygraph test. She agreed, and they set up the test that day, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, despite all the reasons the investigators now had to suspect Diane, they had no clear evidence actually tying her to her husband's murder. So they had to let her go. After 2 weeks of their investigation, Stepp and McCarrick believed they had several strong leads, but nothing concrete. The rival insurance agent's alibi had checked out. There was still a chance he could have hired someone to kill Bob, but it was an outside chance. On top of that, police had not gotten a hit on the Ford Focus from the surveillance footage, and they hadn't gotten anything from the DNA tests conducted on blood samples taken from the crime scene. But finally, as June came to an end, Stepp and McCarrick got a hold of Bob's detailed phone records. And those records immediately raised a red flag. Because there was one number that Bob called over and over again, and it wasn't Diane's. It was a Kansas City, Missouri number belonging to a man that neither investigators had heard of. His name was James Hall. And so Stepp contacted James and asked if he knew who Bob Eidman was. And James said yes, he knew Bob very well. In fact, the two of them had been lovers.